The Philippine Sea at dawn is a place where silence holds its breath. The sky stretches wide in sweeping bands of orange and violet, and the early light paints the surface of the water in shifting mirrors of gold. On the decks of the carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, and Wasp, sailors step through faint shadows as they wipe the thin layer of dew from their jackets. The steel beneath their boots has already begun to warm under the first touch of sunlight. All around them, the aircraft sit in disciplined formation, the rugged F Six F Hellcats, the dependable SB-2C Helldivers, and the broad-shouldered T B F Avengers. Each machine, secured and armed long before the sun broke the horizon, waits like a coiled spring. The men who tend them know the pattern of every cable, every rivet, and every sound each engine should make. They move with quiet purpose, for there is little room for hesitation on a crowded flight deck at dawn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and, if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Among them stands Lieutenant Joe Mercer, a young officer of 24 years. He is sharp-jawed, watchful, and burdened with the kind of restless energy that never fully sleeps. His gloved fingers clutch a small stopwatch, and every few moments he glances down at its face, as if the dial might suddenly betray him. Before the war, Mercer had been a track athlete, a man defined by motion, speed, and the relentless pursuit of seconds. Now, on this metal island surrounded by endless sea, he races not on a field but against time itself. His task is to coordinate a launch sequence so complex that even seasoned officers call it a controlled miracle. He must set into motion the precise choreography that sends every operational aircraft into the air before Japanese scout planes glimpse their position. If the enemy finds them first, the price will be paid in steel, smoke, lives. Behind Mercer, the seasoned squadron leader, Commander Russell Hawk Merriam, pulls the straps of his flight harness tight across his chest. His nickname, Hawk, was born from the way he seemed to spot danger before anyone else, and the pilots under him swear he can sense enemy fighters long before they appear. Though the morning air carries a chill, Merriam wipes perspiration from his palms. Nerves are not weakness. They are awareness, sharpened by experience. Mercer steps beside him and speaks in a low voice, careful not to let uncertainty slip into his tone. 15 minutes, he says. Merriam lifts an eyebrow, skeptical but amused. That even possible? He asks. Mercer answers with only a thin grin. We have practiced it. Today, we prove it. The confidence in Mercer's voice is not born from arrogance. It comes from the hard work of the past year. The American carriers have changed how they think, how they prepare, and how they fight. Lessons carved from the fires of Midway have shaped a new approach. Their deck handling procedures have been redesigned from top to bottom. Coordination between crews, pilots, and machinery has been refined until the entire process resembles an industrial assembly line operating in fast forward. New catapult systems have been installed and tested. And most importantly, the Americans have abandoned the old habit of performing vital tasks deep within the hangar deck. The Japanese still arm their planes below, then lift them topside in careful stages. The Americans now prepare almost everything directly on the flight deck. Fuel, ordnance, mechanical checks, and lineups happen in the open air where efficiency, teamwork, and visibility cut precious minutes off the clock. Simplicity means speed. Speed means time, and time determines who strikes first. Below deck, the pulse of activity is even more intense. Mechanics swarm the interior spaces like determined ants. They move heavy ammunition carts through narrow passageways, their boots ringing against the metal floor. They prime fuel lines and tighten clamps with fingers stained black from grease and hours of labour. Sparks burst from welding torches, and tools clatter sharply against steel panels. Every motion, every shouted instruction, every click of a wrench matters. Down here, minutes are not simply units on a stopwatch. They are the thin boundary between survival and catastrophe. Although the sailors work with confidence, they also understand the weight resting on their actions. They know the Japanese have been at war longer. They know the Japanese Zero fighters can outturn and outclimb anything in the sky if flown by an expert. They know the Japanese pilots have earned reputations as deadly veterans, many with 5, 10, or even 15 confirmed kills to their names. They know that for years, the Japanese command has believed American aviators to be slow, inexperienced, and overly dependent on machinery. That belief has shaped Japanese doctrine, strategy, and expectations. The Americans are well aware of how they are viewed. But this morning is different. This morning is a moment the Japanese admirals have not anticipated. This morning is the culmination of countless hours of planning and practice, of arguments fought in strategy rooms, and of risky ideas tested under pressure. This morning, the Americans aim to do something the Japanese consider impossible. On the wind-washed deck above, Lieutenant Mercer walks briskly, checking each alignment, verifying hand signals, and making sure that every crewman understands the sequence ahead. The aircraft are arranged nose to tail, wings folded where needed, and spaced with tight precision. The deck crew knows their roles instinctively. The ordnance teams, the fueling hands, the catapult operators, and the signal officers. Every man has memorized the order of operations, and every man knows the consequences if even one mistake disrupts the chain. Commander. Merriam climbs the ladder into his Hellcats cockpit. He runs a practiced hand over the gauges, the stick, and the throttle. He feels the thrum of the engine waiting to ignite, a vibration that always fills him with the same mixture of dread and determination. Above him, the sun clears the horizon, casting a gleam across the row of canopies stretching down the deck. This is the moment when fear must give way to duty. Mercer raises his stopwatch once more. The familiar weight steadies his breath. He calls out the first signal, a sharp command that cuts through the roar of engines warming on the deck. One by one, the aircraft prepare to leap into the air. The catapult crews lock into position. The deck teams clear the launch path. The propellers spin faster, slicing the air in blurs of silver. This is not simply a launch, it is a statement. It is proof that adaptation can overcome experience, that discipline can outrun reputation, and that innovation can tilt the balance of war. Below deck, the sailors pause only long enough to listen to the distant thunder of engines firing in sequence. Each blast echoes through the steel walls like the heartbeat of the ship itself. They exchange brief looks, not of fear, but of shared purpose. They know the Japanese believe the Americans cannot act this quickly. They know the Japanese assume they will have the advantage of time. They know the Japanese are confident that their seasoned pilots, their fast Zero fighters, and their past victories will secure the first strike. But the Americans are done living in the shadow of another nation's expectations. They are done being underestimated. They are done accepting the rhythm the Japanese impose on battle. Today, the Americans intend to seize the rhythm for themselves. Lieutenant Mercer lowers the stopwatch, its ticking loud in his ear. This is the moment everything changes. Above him, the engines surge. Around him, the deck crew braces. Ahead of him, the entire Pacific War seems to hold still, balanced on the edge of a single decision. Today, the Americans will show the world something the Japanese never expected, something that will rewrite naval warfare. The late morning heat wrapped itself around the Shokaku like a thick blanket as Admiral Kusaka stood at the center of the bridge, steady and composed amid the constant murmur of machinery. A coded message arrived from a scout plane, carried by a young radioman whose face was still too fresh for war. Kusaka accepted the message with a calm nod. The paper strip was short but heavy with meaning. Enemy task force sighted, likely 2 carriers. The words did not startle him. Instead, he lifted his teacup, took a gentle sip, and gazed out across the open sea with the relaxed confidence of a man surveying a chessboard he believed he already understood. He spoke softly, as if merely noting an expected detail, rather than announcing the presence of a deadly foe. 2 carriers, he said. Likely. Enterprise and Saratoga. Predictable. His staff responded with approving nods. They admired how effortlessly he spoke, how naturally certainty flowed from him. His confidence did not simply fill the room, it settled over the officers like a warm and reassuring fragrance. The Japanese Navy had spent years constructing a doctrine built on speed, discipline, and superior coordination. Countless war games had reinforced the same conclusion. American carriers simply could not match Japanese launch tempo. According to their calculations, American decks could lift around 40 planes at once before the crew needed to reshuffle the entire layout of machines and equipment. In that exact window of time, Japanese carriers could send 60 aircraft hurtling skyward. That 20-plane difference, small in appearance, represented a crushing advantage in execution. It meant that the Japanese could seize the initiative in nearly every early exchange, landing the first blow with greater force and timing. And in naval aviation, timing was everything. Tempo dictated shock, survivability, and momentum. With tempo, a commander could dominate a battle before the enemy even realized it had begun. Kusaka believed in that tempo with absolute devotion. "Prepare first wave," he ordered, as he placed his cup aside with practiced elegance. His voice carried an unspoken promise that the coming strike would unfold exactly as their doctrine predicted. But his air boss, an older officer with a weathered face and sharp instincts, hesitated. He stepped forward slowly, choosing his words with care. "Admiral," he said, "we have no clear report on enemy heading or speed." The bridge quieted, the crew waiting to see whether caution or confidence would prevail. Kusaka did not turn fully toward the officer. He merely lifted his chin slightly. "No matter," he replied. "The Americans need time. We know their limits." His tone was final, so polished and firm that it discouraged further doubt. The bridge officers settled back into their duties, reassured by his unwavering belief. To them, the idea that American pilots and deck crews could dramatically change their operating speed in such a short span of months seemed impossible. Tradition governed naval warfare, and the Japanese tradition had proven itself again and again, yet far beyond their line of sight, the boundaries of that tradition were being rewritten. Aboard the American carriers, advancing toward them, a revolution in deck handling had taken shape, built from relentless drills and unorthodox experimentation. American crews had abandoned the neat and conservative methods of earlier years. They no longer relied on slow, systematic reorganization between waves. Instead, they adopted a system that placed aircraft almost anywhere there was space, trusting their crews to maneuver around the controlled chaos with practiced confidence. It was a messy method, and more than one admiral had winced at its appearance. But it worked. It worked so well that the Americans could now launch nearly 90 planes in roughly 15 minutes, an achievement that shattered every previous assumption. But on the Shokaku, this reality remained hidden behind distance, weather, and the Japanese Navy's faith in its long-standing superiority. Kusaka watched the horizon, unaware that the American carriers were already moving with impossible speed. He imagined their decks still crowded and disorganized, crews rushing to fuel and load aircraft in the clumsy style the Japanese had come to expect. He assumed there was still an hour or more before the Americans could send anything significant into the air. His officers believed the same. Their entire experience told them that the Americans were slow, methodical, and bound by procedure. Still, the air boss could not shake his unease. Despite his respect for the admiral, he sensed that something was amiss. The scout reports were too vague, too delayed. Air felt wrong, like pressure building before an unseen storm. He approached once more cautiously than before. "Admiral," he said, "there are irregularities in the reports. If the enemy carriers have changed their launch procedures—" Kusaka stopped him with a single raised hand. "The Americans are not capable of such rapid transformation," he said. "War does not rewrite fundamentals so easily." His words rolled across the deck with a confident finality that discouraged further argument. And yet, deep in the air boss's gut, something tightened. Experience told him that warfare could indeed change faster than anyone expected, especially when desperation forced innovation. On the flight deck, Japanese planes began rolling into position. Crews moved with crisp discipline, adjusting flaps, checking fuel, and loading ordnance with practiced rhythm. The air vibrated with the roar of engines warming to life. The process was efficient, elegant, reliable, but not fast. Even at peak performance, it required time. The Japanese Navy trusted that time. They believed they had earned it through early detection and superior preparation. But the Americans were already far ahead. On their decks, aircraft were lined up in dense, aggressive formations that defied Japanese expectations. Deck crews shouted instructions, sprinted between machines, and executed their choreography with near-reckless intensity. What once required 30 minutes now required half that. The moment the launch flag dropped, planes surged forward one after another, the sky filling with American aircraft in a continuous stream. In mere minutes, their combined strike force exceeded anything Kusaka imagined possible. If the Japanese commander could have seen that moment, those dozens of American Dauntless and Wildcat silhouettes rising simultaneously, he might have paused. He might have questioned the speed at which the world was changing. But he did not see it. He saw only a calm horizon and believed it reflected a calm situation. Back on the Shokaku, the air boss glanced out once more. The sea looked deceptively peaceful, but his instincts screamed that something enormous was moving toward them. He sensed the rhythm of battle shifting, even though he could not yet see the cause. Still, orders were orders. The first wave would launch. The Japanese strike would soar outward with confidence, and they deeply believed that they were about to strike first. They were not. Just beyond their sight, the American attack was already airborne. An immense and unprecedented force was racing toward them with a speed and density that defied every Japanese war game ever played. The belief in American limits was about to collide with the unstoppable weight of American reality. And as Kusaka lifted his binoculars for another calm look across the horizon, the storm that would shatter his certainty was already on its way, carried by nearly 90 American planes that no one on the Shokaku expected. The moment the clock struck 0700 hours, a tremor of anticipation rippled across the decks of the 3 American carriers. The sky above the Philippine Sea glowed with a pale and growing light, a gentle reminder that dawn did not wait for war to finish its preparations. Lieutenant Joe Mercer stood poised at the edge of the USS Essex flight deck, his signal wand raised high. The first Hellcat crouched at the end of the launch path, its wings locked, its engine rumbling like a caged animal desperate to break free. Mercer exhaled slowly, brought the wand down in a sharp arc, and the fighter roared forward. Its tires screeched, its nose lifted, and in a burst of spray and flame, the Hellcat leapt into the open sky. Mercer clicked his stopwatch. 0 minutes, 0 seconds. 1 aircraft airborne. Before the echo of that first launch faded, another Hellcat thundered forward, its tires scraping the deck before it too leapt into open air. Then, a third followed, engines screaming in unison like the opening notes of a rising symphony. The deck crew moved with blistering speed, folding wings, dragging wheel chocks aside, guiding aircraft into position with sharp hand motions and shouts swallowed by the wind. Radios crackled only when absolutely necessary. Most communication relied on instinct and muscle memory forged through months of tireless drills. Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers formed a continuous stream of steel and motion, feeding into the catapult as though pulled by an invisible current. The flight deck was no longer a simple wooden platform. It had become a living river of motion. By the 3-minute mark, 12 aircraft were already climbing skyward. Mercer blinked, hardly believing the number. But the stopwatch did not lie. At 5 minutes, 22 planes filled the heavens. At 8 minutes, 36 machines soared across the horizon, their silhouettes multiplying like fragments of shadow against the sun. Mercer's throat tightened as he watched the launches accelerate instead of falter. Every carrier crew had trained for this, but training was theory. This was reality. And reality was proving that their unorthodox methods, their controlled chaos, their relentless willpower, were paying off with a speed no naval strategist had predicted. Commander Russell Merriam lifted off with his fighter squadron just 2 minutes later, banking right to join the sprawling formation rising above the carriers. The air around him churned with the thunder of engines, wings slicing through wind, and the glint of steel catching early sunlight. It felt less like flying through ordinary sky and more like navigating a massive, swirling storm of blue-grey metal. 10 minutes passed. 54 aircraft were airborne. The sheer scale of it struck Merriam with awe. This was not the hesitant tempo of a single ship sending a modest number of fighters into the air. This was an armada. This was a declaration. This was proof that the Americans had transformed their carriers into machines of overwhelming efficiency. Below deck, the situation was no less frantic. Sailors shouted to one another through clouds of fumes and steam. "Next, torpedo bomber up," one voice boomed. "Fuel lines clear," echoed another. "Ordnance secure," came the final confirmation before the next Avenger rolled into position. The hangar bay vibrated beneath pounding boots and the roar of machinery. Every hand aboard the carrier fleet knew the importance of these minutes. The faster the launch, the sooner the strike group could reach Japanese waters, and the sooner the Japanese would lose their only advantage, the belief that they would always strike first. Above deck, Mercer reset his launch order. The next sequence flowed into place as though some great invisible gear turned the entire ship. At 12 minutes, 71 American aircraft were airborne. At 14 minutes, 83. Mercer's pulse hammered in his ears. They were about to do it. They were about to accomplish a feat that naval tacticians across the world had considered impossible. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the energy of it, the wind slicing over the deck as more fighters roared forward. Every launch, every signal, every movement formed part of an immense machine that operated at the edge of human ability. Then came the final launches. Avengers rumbled forward in steady succession. A pair of Helldivers screamed skyward like twin bolts of steel lightning. A final line of Hellcats surged ahead, wheels lifting, wings beating against gravity as though the very air had chosen to help them. The stopwatch struck 15 minutes. 90 aircraft filled the sky. 90 machines launched from 3 carriers in the span of 15 heartbeats of a clock. The number itself felt unreal. It was more than double what Japanese doctrine believed possible. It was more than every estimate offered by their most experienced, Admirals. It was a living contradiction to everything the enemy thought they knew. Commander Merriam leveled his Hellcat and looked across the vast formation growing around him. It was not merely a strike group. It was a living storm cloud, a swirling mass of American steel, determination, and precision. The fighters stretched out like the broad wings of a giant predator, while the bombers formed its armored heart. He felt a surge of pride and a shiver of fear. "We are airborne," he radioed to the task force. "The whole damn air group." Back aboard the Essex, Mercer finally let his knees buckle. He collapsed onto the deck, panting as adrenaline drained from his limbs. Sailors around him cheered, slapped shoulders, and embraced whoever stood nearest. But Mercer felt something deeper than pride. Beneath the thrill, beneath the victory of the moment, he sensed the terrible weight of what they had just unleashed. Because soon, very soon, Japanese scout planes would peer across the horizon. They would see the impossible unfolding before their eyes. They would count not 20 aircraft, not 40, but 90. They would watch the sky darken with American planes that no doctrine had accounted for, no wargame had predicted, and no admiral had believed possible. The Japanese admirals who trusted their long-held doctrines would never imagine such speed. They believed American carriers were slow, clumsy, and incapable of changing the rhythm of battle. But today, the Americans had thrown aside the expected script. They had embraced chaos, harnessed urgency, and transformed their flight decks into engines of momentum. Their launch rate was not just faster, it was revolutionary. High above the carriers, Merriam's formation grew into a spear pointed toward the heart of the enemy fleet. The morning sun glimmered off the wings of Hellcats and bombers, turning them into streaks of gold and steel. The roar of their engines blended into a single rising note that promised destruction. Below them, the carriers steadied into the wind, preparing for retrieval hours later when the strike group returned. For now, their work was complete. As Mercer pushed himself back to his feet, he stared at the shrinking dots in the sky. His hands shook, though the morning air was warm. He knew he had helped make history. The Japanese would soon face a truth they never expected. America had surpassed their tempo. The realization would strike with the force of a silent hammer, reshaping every assumption the enemy held about American capability. What had once been considered an impossible feat had now become a stunning demonstration of coordination and willpower. Every sailor aboard the carriers felt it in their bones. The battle had shifted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bridge of the Shokaku had always been a place of quiet confidence, chamber, where steel discipline mixed with the calm assurance that Japan's naval mastery would continue shaping the Pacific. But the atmosphere changed the moment a trembling radio man rushed inside, clutching a fresh transmission from the scout plane circling far beyond the horizon. The air officer seized the message, scanned it quickly, and felt the blood drain from his face. He stepped toward Admiral Kusaka with a stiffness that betrayed the weight of the words he carried. When he spoke, his tone was thin and uneven. "Multiple carriers confirmed," he announced. "Large airborne strike approaching, estimated over 80 aircraft already launched." The bridge fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. Men who had endured years of war, men who had survived storms, fires, and the constant pressure of command, now stood frozen like statues carved from doubt. Admiral Kusaka straightened slowly in his chair. His expression tightened, his jaw clenched, as though his muscles were trying to hold back disbelief. "Impossible," he muttered. "The Americans cannot launch so many so quickly." His voice was not loud, yet its quiver rippled across the room. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain whether they should agree or fear the truth hiding in the scout's message. The air officer forced himself to meet his commander's eyes. "Sir," he said quietly, "they can." The simplicity of the words stabbed deeper than any dramatic warning. Kusaka felt a tremor in his hand, a faint shaking that he quickly hid behind his cloak. For the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor, uncertainty, raw, unwelcome, cold as winter steel, clutched at his heart. He ordered the calculations immediately. "How long," he demanded, "for the Americans to launch 90 planes?" His navigation officer swallowed hard before answering. "Assuming their previous capability. At least 30 to 35 minutes. Kusaka leaned forward, the muscles in his neck, rigid as iron. "And you are saying they launched in?" The air officer hesitated, as though reluctant to speak a number that defied everything they believed. 15 minutes, sir." A chill swept across the bridge like a gust of icy wind, forcing its way through every crack of the ship. Several officers looked away, unable to hide their shock. The numbers were undeniable. The implications were catastrophic. Something fundamental in the nature of American carrier warfare had changed. The enemy they believed they understood had become unrecognizable. Now the truth dawned with brutal clarity. American deck crews had become faster than Japan's elite, trained not through tradition, but through relentless adaptation. Their carriers had been redesigned and optimized for rapid launch, allowing them to operate like factories of war. Their coordination had surpassed anything the Japanese war planners anticipated. Their aviation production was enormous, feeding the fleet with more planes, more engines, more spare parts, and far more pilots than Japan could ever hope to match. Their fighters and bombers no longer trickled from the decks. They erupted in waves. Their pilots, once dismissed as inexperienced, now outnumbered Japanese veterans by overwhelming margins. The advantage Japan once held had evaporated, replaced by a machine of war growing stronger with every passing month. Kusaka whispered the truth that none of his officers dared to say aloud. "We based our doctrine on outdated assumptions." The words tasted bitter. Doctrine had been the foundation of Japanese naval superiority. Doctrine guided their training, their battle plans, their entire belief system. But doctrine had failed to evolve. They had measured the Americans by standards frozen in the year 1941, ignoring how swiftly desperation and industry could transform a nation. In that moment, the Admiral understood that the battle unfolding before him was not simply a contest of ships and aircraft. It was a contest of adaptation versus stagnation. The United States had changed, Japan had not. He snapped back to command with a jolt of urgency. "Prepare our strike," he ordered. "Launch immediately." But the flight deck was not ready. Not even close. Planes were still being fueled. Others were mid-maintenance with panels open and engines partially disassembled. Bomb loads were inconsistent. Some aircraft held torpedoes, others carried half-mounted bombs, and several sat empty, waiting for ordnance crews who were still racing across the deck. Fuel hoses coiled like snakes around the aircraft. Maintenance tools littered the pathways. The deck crew scrambled to clear space, but the confusion only intensified. Men shouted conflicting instructions. Runners sprinted to deliver messages that radios should have conveyed, but interference muddied the airwaves. The perfect, disciplined rhythm that Japanese carriers once prided themselves on collapsed into a frantic rush bordering on panic. Chaos, imbalance, panic. The three words hung like storm clouds over the carrier. The Japanese fleet had always prided itself on order, precision, and elegance of execution. But now, faced with an enemy that had shattered their expectations, they found themselves struggling to adapt. Efficiency dissolved beneath sudden pressure. The heroic calm once displayed by crews across the Pacific now fractured under the weight of looming disaster. Planes that should have been poised for launch sat idle in clusters. Pilots waited inside cockpits, sweat dripping down their temple as minutes slipped away. Officers barked commands that were drowned out by the rising roar of engines. Every second lost made the situation worse. What Admiral Kusaka did not yet know, what none of the officers or pilots aboard the Shokaku yet understood, was that the American strike group was closer than expected. Far above the sunlit clouds, nearly invisible against the pale morning sky, American fighters had already begun their descent. They flew in disciplined silence, engines throttled back to reduce noise. They were shadows moving through heaven, their silhouettes barely noticeable from below. Led by veteran pilots hardened by recent battles, they approached with an eerie calm that masked the destructive force they carried. They did not roar toward the Japanese fleet. They drifted like ghosts preparing to strike. Every moment the Japanese spent scrambling only drew the Americans nearer. The gap between preparation and destruction narrowed like the closing jaws of a trap. On the Shokaku's flight deck, crewmen struggled to wheel torpedo bombers into launch position, unaware that time had already abandoned them. They believed they still had minutes to prepare. They believed their strike could still get airborne. They believed the American attack was distant enough to allow them a fighting chance. But belief did not match reality. The American fighters were almost upon them. The air above the Japanese fleet trembled with the faint hum of engines descending from a height where no scout had ventured. Kusaka gripped the edge of the plotting table, staring at the maps and markers that no longer represented the truth. For years he had trusted calculations, doctrine, and tradition. But now the sea of numbers betrayed him. He felt the crushing weight of realization settle onto his shoulders. The Americans had not only grown stronger, they had surpassed Japan in the very arena where Japan once dominated. The tempo of battle had changed, speed had changed, power had changed. The Pacific itself seemed to shift beneath the Japanese fleet. Above the clouds, the first American fighters dipped their wings, aligning for the opening strike. They were close enough now that the pilots could see the faint gleam of Japanese carrier decks, close enough to choose their targets, close enough to reshape the battle before Japan could even lift its first wave into the air. The moment of realization had broken the Japanese fleet, not with explosions, not with fire, but with truth. And now the storm was descending. The sky above the Philippine Sea was a canvas of pale blue and gold, streaked with faint wisps of cirrus clouds that seemed to stretch forever. From this altitude, Commander Russell Hawk Merriam could see the shimmer of sunlight glinting off the ocean far below, each wave catching light as though the sea itself were alive, trembling beneath the weight of history. He gripped the control stick with steady hands, his knuckles white beneath the leather gloves, and cast a glance over his formation. The air was crisp, carrying only the sound of distant engines and the occasional whisper of wind across his visor. Around him, 89 pilots from the USS Essex, USS Bunker Hill, and USS Wasp maintained tight formation. They were Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers, a lethal ballet of steel, firepower, and human resolve. The Hellcats formed a high umbrella, positioned to fend off Japanese Zero fighters, their engines humming a constant war song as the pilots prepared to intercept any threat. Below them, Helldivers glided, poised for the steep, deadly plunge that would rain explosives upon their targets, wings folded with mechanical precision, bombs balanced and ready. At the rear, the Avengers moved in calculated spreads, torpedoes secured beneath fuselages, engines throttled just enough to maintain speed while conserving momentum for the final attack run. Each plane was a carefully chosen piece of the puzzle, each pilot trained, briefed, and resolute. The scale of the formation was almost incomprehensible from the cockpit, a spearhead of American ingenuity slicing toward an enemy who believed they were still in control of the tempo. Merriam's voice came over the radio with calm authority. "Remember Pearl Harbor," he said, his tone steady, even as adrenaline surged through him. "And remember what they thought of us." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of history, a reminder of the unexpected fire that Americans had unleashed just months before in the Pacific. Behind him, his pilots echoed variations of the same response, their voices tight, controlled, and unwavering. "Roger that," they said, the phrase repeated with variations and inflections that reinforced unity and purpose. Each pilot understood the meaning beyond the words. This was not merely a mission of destruction, it was a message, a demonstration of capability that would rewrite the assumptions of their enemy. The Americans had not merely launched planes quickly that morning, they had unleashed a thunderstorm, a massive, coordinated strike capable of overwhelming even the most seasoned Japanese officers. Each second that passed brought them closer to the unsuspecting carriers below. Each moment drew the inevitable collision nearer. At 12,000 feet, Ensign Cal Fisher, a young fighter pilot aged 22, leaned forward in his cockpit, squinting against the glare of the sun. He was wiry and lean, with hands trained to grip the stick instinctively, muscles conditioned from years of training flights and simulated dogfights. He spotted movement far below, the faint glimmer of steel and color indicating life on the water. "Carrier group in sight," he called over the radio, his voice calm despite the pounding of his heart. His observation triggered a chain of awareness throughout the formation, eyes and sensors adjusting to the presence of the enemy. From this altitude, the Japanese carriers appeared as small dots, deceptively serene, vulnerable, and utterly unaware of the storm descending upon them. Deck crews hurried to secure aircraft, oblivious to the fact that the Americans were already within striking distance. Bomb bays had not been checked fully. Torpedoes were still being loaded onto some planes, and pilots scrambled to complete final checks under the pressure of alarm signals. The contrast between preparation and readiness was stark. The Americans had achieved something remarkable. Through innovation, training, and relentless rehearsal, they had effectively nullified the traditional advantage of Japanese tempo, launching 90 aircraft in the span of 15 minutes. Merriam looked over his wingmen and felt the weight of responsibility, the quiet pressure that accompanies command in moments that define history. The air was taut, yet he noticed the absence of hesitation among his pilots. They were disciplined, their focus absolute. Even at this altitude, the formation was precise, a pattern of deadly intent visible only to those trained to read it. The Hellcats positioned to intercept enemy fighters, their pilots scanning the skies for any sign of the Japanese Zeros that had previously dominated the Pacific. The Helldivers adjusted angles and altitudes, readying their dives for maximum destructive effect. The Avengers maintained a subtle, backward-facing spread, primed for torpedo runs against targets that were, as of now, oblivious. Each aircraft was a component of a larger plan, each movement orchestrated to perfection, yet fluid enough to adapt to any sudden threat. It was a balance between rigidity and flexibility, discipline and instinct. High above, the sun reflected off the metal decks of the Japanese carriers, small and vulnerable in appearance from 12,000 feet, though massive in reality. The Americans closed steadily, their approach deliberate yet relentless. Pilots noted the lack of maneuvering below, the absence of alert formations, the slow, almost ceremonial movement of crewmen trying to prepare for a strike they had not anticipated. It was a chilling reminder that belief, when divorced from reality, could be more dangerous than any weapon. The Japanese carriers had assumed superiority, relying on doctrine developed in an earlier era, trusting calculations that no longer held true in the face of American adaptation. They had counted on tempo, on experience, on a combination of skill and tradition to outmatch the enemy. But the Americans had rewritten the rules. Adaptation had triumphed over arrogance. Reality had overtaken myth. The formation of American aircraft descended with inexorable precision, the planes almost humming with controlled energy. Merriam observed the symmetry, the disciplined lines that spoke of hours of training and countless repetitions. He recalled the early days of the Pacific War, the fear that had once accompanied the first encounters with Japanese naval air power. He remembered Pearl Harbor and the shock of underestimating an enemy. But today, that lesson had been internalized. Today, American pilots and crews were the embodiment of preparation, speed, and superior coordination. Every engine, every control surface, every pilot action had been choreographed to perfection. As the distance between the Americans and the Japanese shrank, the carriers below remained tragically unaware. The flight decks were alive with human activity, crews moving in frantic but uncoordinated patterns, ordnance still being loaded, bombs still secured, fuel lines active and exposed. The Americans had achieved the strategic advantage without firing a single shot. In naval warfare, timing was everything. Today, the timing favored the United States. Every second delayed in launching or organizing would compound into disaster. Above, the American spearhead maintained altitude and discipline, exploiting the opening that Japanese assumptions had created. Merriam's voice came over the intercom once more. Maintain formation, watch your sectors, be ready to engage, remember your training. Each pilot absorbed the command without hesitation. There was no fear in their movements, only precision and focus. Ensign Fisher adjusted his throttle, keeping pace with the line, noting the spread of his fellow Hellcats, the dive angles of the 18 Helldivers, the torpedo positioning of the Avengers. Every visual cue was accounted for, every possibility considered. This was not merely an attack, it was a culmination of everything the Americans had learned, practiced, and perfected since the outbreak of the Pacific War. High above, the wind hummed around the aircraft, carrying with it the distant scent of salt water and the faint vibration of countless engines. The Americans were within striking range, yet the Japanese remained unaware. The calculus of battle had shifted, not through brute force alone, nor through sheer numbers, not because of luck or fortune. The decisive factor was adaptation, the ability to learn, to refine, to apply lessons of prior engagements in ways that their opponent could not anticipate. The Japanese had believed in their own myths, myths of invincibility, myths of procedural superiority, myths of tempo and training that were no longer valid. The Americans had taken those myths, tested them, and shattered them with precision. Below, the small dots of the Japanese carriers seemed fragile, suspended in a world unaware of the storm descending. Above, the Americans adjusted altitude, aligning dive angles, setting up intercepts, and communicating with subtle hand gestures when radio silence was required. The formation moved as a single entity, each pilot instinctively aware of their position relative to others, a living, breathing extension of strategy itself. The sky was their domain. The ocean below remained theirs to command soon enough, but only if this orchestration of air power could be executed without disruption. Merriam exhaled slowly, recognizing the weight of the moment. At 12,000 feet, far from the reach of deck guns, and below the immediate sight of radar operators, the battle was already decided. Not because of courage, not because of luck, not because of a single heroic action or fluke of chance. The victory had been carved out by discipline, by preparation, by the ability to see the limitations of an opponent and exploit them fully. The Japanese, for all their skill and experience, had been unprepared for the scale, the speed, and the coordination of American carrier aviation. Their belief in their own superiority had blinded them to reality, and that blindness would cost them dearly. As the American strike force approached the point of engagement, Merriam allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The sky was bright, the sea calm, and yet the tension in the air was palpable. The hundreds of engines hummed in a controlled chorus, wings cut through sunlight, and the pilots maintained their focus with unwavering attention. In this moment, the future of the battle and perhaps the Pacific was determined. Adaptation had won. Doctrine alone could not save the Japanese fleet from the consequences of its own assumptions. And above all, the Americans understood that preparation and execution, when applied with precision, could render even the most confident opponent impotent. From the perspective of 12,000 feet, the Japanese carriers were small, almost insignificant. The Americans were poised, ready to strike, and fully aware of their advantage. They had mastered the art of launching the impossible, transforming speed into a weapon, coordination into a force multiplier. The battle had been decided before it even began, not in the clash of steel, not in the roar of engines or explosions, but in the understanding that one navy had adapted while the other remained trapped by its own beliefs. The storm of aircraft overhead was not just a tactical advantage, it was a psychological dominion. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered silently, invisibly, above the clouds. Commander Merriam tightened his grip on the control stick, eyes scanning the horizon, mind focused on the orders, the formation, and the inevitable engagement that would follow. Every pilot in the formation mirrored his determination, their training and coordination converging in perfect symmetry. The Americans were ready, the Japanese were vulnerable. The outcome, though untested by gunfire, had already been written in the skies. The clouds above the Japanese fleet parted as sunlight gleamed on the American formation. The spearhead was complete, a mixture of agility, firepower, and precision, slicing through the open sky. The planes adjusted altitude, their shadowed forms falling across the water like an omen. Below, the Japanese remained unaware, their doctrine still guiding them, their assumptions still intact. Yet those assumptions were now a liability, a fatal miscalculation. And in that moment, 12,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, the battle was not just imminent, it was decided. The Americans had seized initiative, mastered the skies, and demonstrated that adaptability, courage, and preparation could render any traditional advantage meaningless. The Japanese carriers, for all their history, skill, and pride, faced the inevitable. The lesson was clear. The Pacific War had shifted, and those who refused to see beyond old beliefs would pay the price. By evening, the skies over the Philippine Sea were quiet again, a vast expanse of soft indigo stretching to the horizon. Smoke trails from the morning's carnage had faded, and small fragments of wreckage floated silently in the water, reminders of the Japanese fleet's retreat, battered and broken beyond recovery. The American carriers moved with tireless efficiency, deck crews already preparing for the next launch, their actions precise, relentless, and disciplined. Lieutenant Joe Mercer stood on the Essex flight deck, watching the orange glow of the setting sun scatter across the ocean like embers drifting on water. Every wave shimmered with reflected light, every ripple a quiet echo of the storm that had passed hours before. Commander Russell Hawk Merriam landed his Hellcat beside Mercer, climbing out with careful deliberation and removing his helmet. The deck smelled faintly of fuel, oil, and salt, a scent that had become familiar in the days of training, chaos, and combat. Mercer checked his stopwatch one final time, the metal cool under his fingers. 90 planes, he said softly, voice barely above the hum of residual engines. 15 minutes. Merriam placed a firm hand on Mercer's shoulder. That, he said, is how you change the war. The Japanese admirals had never expected it, never prepared for it, never believed it possible. But history is not written by those confident in outdated methods. It is written by those who dare to innovate, to push beyond expectation, and to redefine what is possible. On that morning, in 15 minutes of controlled chaos, the United States Navy reinvented carrier warfare. The Pacific would never be the same. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.